The power of mind images. As long as the self is in bondage to the false personal self of evil, so long as there is not even a possibility of freedom. For these two are contraries. But when free from the grasp of selfish personality, he reaches his real nature. Bliss and being shine forth by their own light, like the full moon free from the blackness. But he who in the body thinks, "This am I," a delusion built up by the mind through darkness, when this delusion is destroyed for him without remainder, there arises for him the realization of self as the eternal, free from all bondage. The treasure of the bliss of the eternal is guarded by the terrible serpent of personality, very powerful, enveloping the self with three fierce heads, the three nature powers, cutting off these three heads with the great sword of discernment, guided by the divine teachings, and destroying the serpent, the wise man may enter into that joy-bringing treasure. So long as there is even a trace of the taint of the poison in the body, how can there be freedom from sickness? In just the same way, there is no freedom for him who seeks union while selfishness endures. When the false self ceases utterly and the motions of the mind caused by it come to an end, then, by discerning the hidden self, the real truth that I am that is found. Give up at once the thought of I in the action of the selfish personality, in the changeful self, which is but a reflection of the real self, to storing rest in the self, from falsely attributing reality to which are incurred birth and death and old age, fruitful in sorrow, the pilgrimage of the soul. But reality belongs to the hidden self, whose form is consciousness, whose body is bliss, whose nature is ever one, the conscious self, the master, whose form is bliss, whose glory is unspeakable. There is no cause of the soul's pilgrimage but the attribution of the reality of this to the selfish personality. Therefore, this selfish personality, the enemy of the self, like a thorn in the throat of the eater, being cut away by the great sword of knowledge, thou shalt enjoy the bliss of the self's sovereignty according to thy desire. Therefore, bringing to an end the activity of the selfish personality, all passion being laid aside when the supreme object is gained, rest silent, enjoying the bliss of the self, in the eternal through the perfect self, from all doubt free. Mighty selfishness, even though cut down root and all, if brought to life again, even for a moment, in thought, causes 100 dissipations of energy as a cloud shaken by the wind in the rainy seasons pours forth its floods. After seizing the enemy, selfishness, no respite at all is to be given to it by thoughts of sensual objects. Just this is the cause of its coming to life again, as water is of the lime tree that had withered away. The desire is constituted by the bodily self. How can the cause of desire be different? Hence, the motion of enticement to sensual objects is the cause of world bondage through attachment to what is other than self. From increase of action, it is seen that the seed of bondage is energized. When action is destroyed, the seed is destroyed. Hence, let him check sensual action. From the growth of mind images comes the action. From action, the mind image grows. Hence the man's pilgrimage ceases not. To cut the bonds of the world's pilgrimage, both must be burned away by the ascetic, and the growth of mind images comes from these two, imagining and external action. Growing from these two, it brings forth the pilgrimage of the soul. The way of destroying these three in every mode of consciousness should be constantly sought. By looking on all as eternal, everywhere, in every way, and by strengthening the mind image of real being, this triad comes to melt away. In the destruction of actions will arise the destruction of imaginings, and from this the dispersal of mind images. The thorough dispersal of mind images is freedom. This is called freedom, even in life. When the mind image of the real grows up in the dispersal of the mind's alarms, and the mind image of the selfish personality melts away, as even thick darkness is quickly melted away before the light of the sun. The action of the greatest darkness, the snare of unreality, is no longer seen when the Lord of Day is arisen. So in the shining of the essence of secondless bliss, no bond exists, no scent of sorrow. Transcending every visible object of sense, fixing the mind on pure being, the totality of bliss, with right intentness within and without, pass the time while the bonds of action last. Wavering and reliance on the eternal must never be allowed. Wavering is death. Thus said the son of the evolver. There is no other danger for him who knows but this wavering as to the self's real nature. Thence arises delusion, and thence selfish personality. Thence comes bondage, and therefrom sorrow. Through beholding sensual objects, forgetfulness bewilders a wise man even as a woman her favorite lover. As sedge pushed back does not remain, even for a moment, just in the same way does the world glamour close over a wise man who looks away from the real. If the imagination, falling even a little from its aim towards outward objects, it falls on and on, through unsteadiness, like a player's fallen on a row of steps. If the thought enters into sensual objects, it becomes intent on their qualities. From this intentness immediately arises desire, and from desire, every action of man. Hence, than this wavering, there is no worse death. For one who has gained discernment, who has held the eternal in spiritual concentration, by right intentness, he at once gains success. Be thou intent on the self with all carefulness. Then comes the loss of knowledge of one's real being, and he who has lost it falls, and the destruction of him who thus falls is seen, but not restoration. Let him put away the willful motions of the mind, the cause of every evil act. He who has unity in life has unity after his body is gone. The scripture of sentences says that he who beholds difference has fear. Whenever even a wise man beholds difference in the endless eternal, though only as much as an atom, what he beholds through wavering becomes a fear to him through its difference. All scripture, tradition, and logic disregarding, whoever makes the thought of self in visible things falls upon sorrow after sorrow, thus disregarding, he is like a thief in darkness. He whose delight is attachment to the real, freed, he gains the greatness of the self, eternal. But he who delights in attachment to the false perishes. This is seen in the case of the thief and him who is no thief. The ascetic, who has put away the cause of bondage, attachment to the unreal, stands in the vision of the self saying, "This self am I." This resting in the eternal brings joy by experiencing it, and takes away the supreme sorrow that we feel, whose cause is unwisdom. Attachment to the outward brings as its fruit the perpetual increase of evil mind images. Knowing this, and putting away outward things by discernment, let him place his attachment in the self forever. When the outward is checked, there is restfulness from emotion. When emotion is at rest, there is vision of the Supreme Self. When the Self is seen, the bondage of the world is destroyed. The checking of the outward is the path of freedom. Who, being learned, discerning between real and unreal, knowing the teaching of the Scripture and beholding the supreme object with understanding, would place his reliance on the unreal, even though longing to be free, like a child, compassing his own destruction. There is no freedom for him who is full of attachment to the body and its like. For him who is free, there is no wish for the body and its like. The dreamer is not awake. He who is awake dreams not. But these things are the opposites of each other. Knowing the self as within and without, in things stable and moving, discerning this through the self, through its comprehending all things, putting off every disguise, and recognizing no division, standing firm through the perfect self, such a one is free. To the all-self comes the cause of freedom from bondage. Then the being of the all-self, there is no other cause. And this arises when there is no grasping after the outer. He gains the being of the all-self by perpetually resting on the self. How should cessation of grasping after the outer not fail for him who, through the bodily self, remains with mind attached to enjoyment of outward objects, and thus engages in action? It can only be effortfully accomplished by those who have renounced the central aims of all acts and rites, who are perfected in resting on the eternal self, who know reality, who long for reality and bliss in the self. The scripture that speaks of him who is at peace, controlled, teaches the ecstasy of the ascetic, whose work is the study of wisdom, to the end of gaining the all-self. The destruction of personality which has risen up in power cannot be done at once, even by the learned, except those who are immovably fixed in the ecstasy which no doubt can assail. But the mind images are of endless rebirth. Binding a man with the delusion of belief in his personality through the power that veils, the power that propels, cast him forth through its potencies. The victory over this compelling power cannot be accomplished until the power that veils has come to cessation with residue. The power that veils is, through the force of its own nature, destroyed. When the seer is discerned from what is seen, as milk is distinguished from water. Perfect discernment, born of clear awakening, arises free from doubt. and pure of all bondage where there is no propelling power towards delusive objects. Once the division is made between the real natures of the seer and what is seen, he cuts the bonds of delusion that glamour makes. And after that, there is no more pilgrimage for the free. The flame of discernment of the oneness of the higher and the lower burns up the forest of unwisdom utterly. What seed of the soul's pilgrimage can there be for him who has gained being in which there is no duality? And the cessation of the veiling power arises from the perfect knowledge. The destruction of false knowledge is the cessation of the pain engendered by the propelling power. The triple air is understood by knowing the real nature of the rope. Therefore, the reality of things is to be known by the wise to the end of freedom from bondage. As iron from union with fire, so from union with the real, thought expands as material things. Hence, the triple effect of this, seen in delusion, dream, desire, is but a mirage. Thence come all changing forms in nature, beginning with personality and ending with the body, and all sensual objects. These are unreal, because subject to change every moment, but the self never changes. Consciousness, eternal, non-dual, partless, uniform, witness of intellect and the rest, different from existent and non-existent. Its real meaning is the idea of I, a union of being and bliss. This is the higher self. He who thus understands, discerning the real from the unreal, ascertaining reality by his own awakened vision, knowing his own self as partless awakening, freed from these things, reaches peace in the self. Then melts the heart's knot of unwisdom without residue, when through the ecstasy, in which there is no doubt, arises the vision of the non-dual self. Through the mind's fault are built the thoughts of thou and I and this. In the Supreme Self, which is non-dual and beyond which there is nothing, but when ecstasy is reached, all his doubts melt away through apprehension of the real. Peaceful, controlled, possessing the supreme cessation, perfect in endurance, entering into lasting ecstasy, the ascetic makes the being of the all-self his own, thereby burning up perfectly the doubts that are born of the darkness of unwisdom. He dwells in bliss in the form of the eternal, without deed or doubt. They who rest on the self, that is consciousness, who have put away the outward, the imaginations of the ear and the senses, and selfish personality, they, verily, are free from the bonds and snares of the world, but not they who only meditate on what others have seen. The self is divided by the division of its disguises. When the disguises are removed, the self is lonely and pure. Hence, let the wise man work for the removal of the disguises by resting in the ecstasy that is free from doubt. Attracted by the self, the man goes to the being of the self by resting on it alone. The grub, thinking on the bee, builds up the nature of the bee. The grub, throwing off attachment to other forms and thinking intently on the bee, takes on the nature of the bee. Even thus, he who seeks for union, thinking intently on the reality of the Supreme Self, perfectly enters that self, resting on it alone. Very subtle as it were is the reality of the Supreme Self, nor can it be reached by gross vision. By the exceedingly subtle state of ecstasy, it is to be known by those who are worthy, whose minds are altogether pure. As gold, purified in the furnace, rids itself of the dross and reaches the quality of its own self, so the mind, ridding itself of the dross of substance, force, and darkness, through meditation, enters into reality. When purified by the power of uninterrupted intentness, the mind is thus melted in the eternal. Then ecstasy is purified of all doubt and of itself enjoys the essence of secondless bliss. Through this ecstasy comes destruction of the knot of accumulated mind images, destruction of all works, within and without, forever and altogether. The form of the self becomes manifest without any effort at all. Let him know that thinking is 100 times better than Scripture. That concentration, thinking the matter out, is 100,000 times better than thinking. That ecstasy, free from doubt, is endlessly better than concentration. Through unwavering ecstasy is clearly understood the reality of the eternal, fixed and sure. This cannot be when other thoughts are confused with it by the motions of the mind. Therefore, with powers of sense controlled, enter in ecstasy in the hidden self. With mind at peace perpetually, destroy the darkness made by beginningless unwisdom through the clear view of the oneness of the real. The first door of union is the checking of voice, the cessation of grasping, freedom from expectation and longing, the character bent ever on the one end. The centering of the mind on the one end is the cause of cessation of sensuality. Control is the cause that puts an end to imaginings. By peace, the mind image of the personality is melted away, and from this arises unshaken enjoyment of the essence of bliss in the eternal forever, for him who seeks union. Therefore the checking of imagination is ever to be practiced effortfully, O ascetic. Hold voice in the self, hold the self in intellect, hold intellect in the witness of intellect, and merging the witness in the perfect self, enjoy supreme peace. The seeker for union shares the nature of each disguise: body, vital breath, sense, mind, intellect, when his thoughts are fixed on that disguise. When he ceases from this sharing, the ascetic reaches perfect cessation and happiness and is plunged in the essence of being and bliss. Renouncing inwardly, renouncing outwardly, this is possible only for him who is free from passion. And he who is free from passion renounces all attachment within and without, through the longing for freedom. Outward attachment arises through sensual objects, inward attachment through personality. Only he who, resting in the eternal, is free from passion, is able to give them up. Freedom from passion and awakening are the wings of the spirit. O wise man, understand these two wings, for without them you cannot rise to the crown of the tree of life. Soul vision belongs to him who is free from passion. Steady inspiration belongs to the soul seer. Freedom from bondage belongs to the reality of inspiration. Enjoyment of perpetual bliss belongs to the self that is free. I see no engenderer of happiness greater than freedom from passion for him who is self-controlled. If very pure inspiration of the self be joined to it, he enters into sovereignty of self-dominion. This is the door of young freedom everlasting. There do thou ever fix thy consciousness on the real self, and always free from attachment to what is other than this for the sake of the better way. Cut off all hope in sensual objects which are like poison, the cause of death. Abandon all fancies of birth and family and social state. Put all ritual actions far away. Renounce the illusion of self dwelling in the body. Center the consciousness on the self. Thou art the seer. Thou art the stainless. Thou art in truth the supreme, secondless, eternal. Firmly fixing the mind on the goal, the eternal, keeping the outward senses in their own place, with form unmoved, heedless of the body's state, entering into the oneness of self and eternal by assimilating the self and rising above all differences. Forever drink the essence of the bliss of the eternal in the self. What profit is there in other things that give no joy? Free, even in life. Ceasing to feed the imagination on things not self, full of darkness causing sorrow, bend the imagination on the self, whose form is bliss, the cause of freedom. This is the self-luminous witness of all, ever shining through the veil of the soul, making the one aim the self that is the contrary of all things unreal. Realize it by identification with its partless nature. Naming this from its undivided being, its freedom from all other tendencies, let him know it clearly from being of the own nature of self. Firmly realizing selfhood in that, abandoning selfhood in the selfish personality, stand towards it as a disinterested onlooker stands towards the fragments of a broken vase. Entering the purified inner organ into the witness whose nature is the self, who is pure awakening, leading upward step by step to unmoving firmness, let him then gain vision of perfection. Let him gain vision of the self, freed from all disguises built up by ignorance of the self. Body, senses, vitality, emotion, personality. The self whose nature is partless and perfect, like universal ether. The ether, freed from its 100 disguises, water pots, jars, corn measures, and the like, is one, and not divided. Thus also the pure supreme, freed from personality, is one. All disguises, beginning with the evolver and ending with the log, are mirage only. Therefore, let him behold his own perfect self, standing in the self's oneness. Whatever by error is built up as different from that, is in reality that only, not different from that. When the error is destroyed, the reality of the snake that was seen shines forth as the rope. Thus, the own nature of all is the self. The evolver is the self. The pervader is the self. The Sky Lord is the self. The destroyer is the self. All this universe is the self. There is nothing but the self. Inward is the self, outward also is the self. The self is to the east, the self is also to the west. The self is to the south, the self is also to the north. The self is above, the self is beneath. Just as wave and foam, eddy and bubble are in their own nature water, so from the body to the personality, all is consciousness, the pure essence of consciousness. Being, verily, is all this world. That is known of voice and mind. There is nothing else than being, standing on nature's other shore. Are cup and water pot and jar anything but earth? He who is deluded by the wine of glamour speaks of thou and I. When by repeated effort naught remains but this, the Scripture says, declaring absence of duality to put an end to false transference of reality. Like ether, free from darkness, free from wavering, free from limits, free from motion, free from change, having neither a within nor a without, having no other than it, having no second, is the Self, the Supreme Eternal. What else is there to be known? What more is there to be said? The Eternal, the Life, the Self is seen here under many forms. All in this world is the Eternal, the secondless Eternal. The Scripture says, I am the Eternal. Knowing this clearly, those whose minds are awakened, who have abandoned the outward becoming the eternal, dwell in the Self, which is extending consciousness and bliss. This, verily, is sure. Kill out desire that springs up through thought of self in the body formed of darkness, then violent passion in the formal body woven of the breath. Knowing the Self whose fame is sung in the hymns, who is eternal and formed of bliss, stand in the being of the Eternal. As long as the Son of Man enjoys this body of death, he is impure. From the enemies arises the weariness that dwells in birth and death and sickness. When he knows the pure Self of benign form, immovable, then he is free from these. Thus says the Scripture too. When all delusive qualities attributed to the Self are put away, the Self is the Supreme Eternal, perfect, secondless, changeless. When the activity of the imagination comes to rest in the higher Self, the Eternal that wavers not, then no more wavering is seen, and vain words only remain. The belief in this world is built up of unreality. In the one substance, changeless, formless, undifferentiated, what separateness can exist? In the one substance in which no difference of seer, seeing, seen exist, which is changeless, formless, undifferentiated, what separateness can exist? In the one substance, like the world ocean full to overflowing, changeless, formless, undifferentiated, whence can separateness come? Where the cause of delusion melts away like darkness in light, in the secondless supreme reality, undifferentiated, what separateness can there be? In the supreme reality, the very Self of oneness, how could any word of difference dwell? By whom is difference perceived in purely blissful dreamlessness? For this world no longer is, whether past, present, or to come. After awakening to the supreme reality in the real Self, the Eternal, from all wavering free, the snake seen in the rope exists not, nor even a drop of water in the desert mirage, where the deer thirsts. This duality is mere glamour, for the supreme reality is not twofold. Thus the Scripture says, and it is directly experienced in dreamlessness. By the learned it has been perceived that the thing attributed has no existence apart from the substance, as in the case of the serpent and the rope. The distinction comes to life through delusion. This distinction has its root in imagining. When imagining ceases, it is no more. Therefore bring imagining to rest in the higher self whose form is concealed. In soul vision, the wise man perceives in his heart a certain wide extending awakening, whose form is pure bliss, incomparable, the other shore, forever free, where is no desire, limitless as the ether, partless, from wavering, free, the perfect, eternal. In soul vision, the wise man perceives in his heart the reality free from growth and change, whose being is beyond perception, the essence of equalness, unequaled, immeasurable, perfectly taught by the words of inspiration, eternal, praised by us. In soul vision, the wise man perceives in his heart the unfading, undying reality, which by its own being can know no setting, like the shimmering water of the ocean, bearing no name, where quality and change have sunk to rest eternal, peaceful, one. Through intending the inner mind to it, gain vision of the self in its own form, the partless sovereignty. Sever thy bonds that are stained with the stain of life, and effortfully make thy manhood fruitful. Standing in the self, realize the self in being, the self from every disguise set free, being, consciousness, bliss, the secondless. Thus shalt thou build no more for going forth. The mighty soul no more regards this body, cast aside like a corpse, seen to be but the shadow of the man, come into being as his reflection, through his entering into the result of his works. Drawing near to the eternal, stainless awakening, whose nature is bliss, put very far away this disguise whose nature is inert and foul, nor let it be remembered again at all. For the remembrance of what has been cast forth builds for disdain. Burning this up with its root in the flame of the real self, the unwavering eternal, the wise man stands excellent as the self, through the self which is eternal, pure, awakening bliss. The body is strung on the thread of works already done, and is impure as the blood of slaughtered kine. Whether it goes forward or stands, the knower of reality regards it not again, for his life is dissolved in the eternal, the self of bliss. Knowing the partless bliss, the self as his own self, with what desire or from what cause could the knower of reality cherish the body? Of the perfect adept is this fruit, of the seeker for union, free even in life, to taste without and within the essence of being and bliss in the self. The fruit of cleanness is awakening. The fruit of awakening is quiescence. From realizing the bliss of the self comes peace. This fruit, verily, quiescence bears. When the latter of these is absent, the former is fruitless. The supreme end is the incomparable enjoyment of the self's bliss. The famed fruit of wisdom is not to tremble before manifest misfortune. The various works that were done in the season of delusion, worthy of all blame, how could a man deign to do them after discernment has been gained? Let the fruit of wisdom be cessation from unreality. A continuation therein is the fruit of unwisdom. This is clearly seen. If there be not this difference between him who knows and him who knows not, as in the presence of the mirage to the thirsty deer, where is the manifest fruit of wisdom? If the heart's knot of unwisdom be destroyed without remainder, how could sensual things cause continuance in unreality, in him who has no desire? When mind images arise not in the presence of sensual things, this is the limit of purity. When the personal idea does not arise, this is the limit of illumination. When life activity that has been dissolved does not arise again, this is the limit of quiescence. He whose thought is free from outward objects, through standing ever in the nature of the eternal, who is as lightly concerned with the enjoyment of sensual things followed by others as a sleeping child, looking on this world as a land beheld in dream, when consciousness comes back, enjoying the fruit of endless holy deeds, he is rich and worthy of honor in the world. This sage, standing firm in wisdom, reaches being and bliss. He is changeless, free from all acts, for his self is dissolved in the eternal. Being that is plunged in the oneness of the eternal and the self made pure, that wavers not and is consciousness alone, is called wisdom. They say he stands firm in wisdom, in whom this wisdom steadfastly dwells. He in whom wisdom is firmly established, who enjoys unbroken bliss, by whom the manifested world is almost unheeded, is called free, even in life. He who with thought dissolved is yet awake, though free from the bondage of waking life, whose illumination is free from impure mind images, he verily is called free, even in life. He who perceives that his soul's pilgrimage is ended, who is free from disunion even while possessing division, whose imagination is free from imaginings, he verily is called free, even in life. He who even while this body exists, regards it as a shadow, who has no sense of personality or possessions, these are the marks of him who is free in life, whose mind lingers not over the past nor goes out after the future. When perfect equanimity is gained, this is the mark of him who is free even in life. In this world whose very nature is full of differences, where quality and defect are distinguished, to regard all things everywhere as the same, this is the mark of him who is free even in life. Accepting wished and unwished objects with equanimity in the self, and changing not in either event, is the mark of him who is free even in life. When the sage's imagination is fixed on tasting the essence of the bliss of the eternal, so that he distinguishes not between what is within and without, this is the mark of him who is free even in life. Who is free from thought of I and my, in body and senses and their works, who stands in equanimity, bears the mark of one who is free in life. He who has discerned the eternal in the self through the power of sacred books, who is free from the bondage of the world, bears the mark of one who is free even in life. He who never identifies himself with the body and senses, nor separates himself in thought from what is other than these, bears the mark of one who is free even in life.